right, good afternoon all. Welcome to Arlington for our spring meeting. And I'd like to welcome you to the American Lobster Board. We're going to call this meeting to order. The first item on our agenda this morning is the approval of the agenda. Is there any addition or change that anybody would like to make to the agenda? Okay, Emerson Hasbrook?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. So I have a couple of items relative to the agenda. First, I would request that we visit item 5 before we visit item 4. I think it would be helpful to get an update or get the update from Maine and New Hampshire on industry meetings before we consider addendum 32. So that's the first item relative to the agenda that I'd like to see changed.
Is there any objection by the board to switching agenda item 4 and 5? Seeing no hands, we will flip-flop those two agenda items and we will do the report prior to the discussion on the addendum. Go ahead with your second.
Yes, thank you. So back at our March 18th, 2025 meeting, there was a motion made and there was a motion to substitute. And then during discussion on that motion to substitute, there was a motion to postpone to the May 2025 meeting. And that motion to postpone that discussion to the May 2025 meeting was passed by the board. And I don't see on our agenda where we are going to bring that postponed motion back to the board.
Just bear with us one moment, Emerson. We're just looking up that motion, so bear with us here.
Okay.
So Emerson, that motion was not, the option in the document was not added to the addendum. So if we bring that motion back to the table, which it does need to come back to the table, but if the document would have to go back out for public comment again if you wanted to include it in the addendum itself. So it was my understanding that by postponing it, that motion then died in terms of adding it to the document. We are getting quarterly updates from the states on how they're moving forward and talking with their industry. And then I assume that at some point we will have a direction from those states on what action will be taken. So it seemed to me that that was satisfactory to the board at March, but we can have further discussions on that. But if we want to add it to the addendum itself, then it would have to go back out for public comment.
Thank you, Tony. Two things. One is just process, right? One is we approved a motion to postpone until the May 2025 meeting. So I don't know how we can just ignore that. I think in terms of process, it has to come back to the board. And in postponing that, I don't know that the consensus of the board was essentially to ignore it and just let it die. I don't know, you know, I don't want to put other people on the spot, but I don't know if the maker of that postponed motion as well as the seconder are of the same feeling that it was postponed and therefore it's dead and we don't need to consider anything anymore.
I'll say that it was staff's understanding that by moving forward with the addendum document for public comment, that it was not going to be included in the addendum because anything that is in the addendum has to be taken out for public comment. We have put it into it will be pulled up during the addendum discussion though, and then the board can take it back up and vote on it. But if there's an affirmative vote, then we would have to take the document back out for public comment.
So then what are we going to bring back up?
We'll bring that motion back up.
Okay, and that's going to occur when?
During the addendum discussion today.
Okay, thank you. I also have a comment on the proceedings. Are you ready for that, Madam Chair, or do you want me to wait?
We're ready, go ahead.
So on the proceedings, the cover page of the proceedings indicates that the meeting was held on March 18th, 2024. In the proceedings itself, it says that the board was called to order on Tuesday, March 18th, 2024. And at the top of each page of the proceedings, it indicates that the meeting was March of 2024. I think all of those typos need to be corrected to make it clear that the meeting was in March of 2025, not 2024. Thank you.
Thank you, Emerson. Yes, those changes are being made right now. Are there any other changes to the proceedings? Seeing none, are there any objections to the proceedings as amended today with 2025 replacing 2024? Seeing no objections, the amended proceedings are approved. Okay, next up will be public comment. This time we'll take public comment on items that are not on the agenda. So I would like to add that the Outer Cape Cod V-notch issue is not on the agenda today. And if you do wish to speak on that and have new comments that have not already been provided verbally at the public hearing or in writing, which all of the commissioners have received and been able to read, then I'll ask that you make a comment on any new material. If at this time you do have a comment on any item not on the agenda, if you could go ahead and raise your hand so we get an idea of how many people might like to make a public comment. Okay, anyone in the room? Nope, seeing no hands, we will move on to our change of order. So we're going to go to the state of Maine first for an update on industry meetings. And then after that, we'll go back to me for the state of New Hampshire update. So I recognize Carl Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's good to be here, everybody. Good afternoon. Okay, I'll give a little update on what the state of Maine has been doing since the March meeting. I've got 5 slides, I believe, that characterize some of the meetings. So not sure who to indicate to advance the slides. Great, very good. Next slide, please. Okay, so what have we been up to? We've had 7 zone council meetings. So each zone is representing approximately 500 to 1,000 fishermen. From furthest south was in York, and furthest east was in Machias. We've had 2 lobster advisory council meetings. So this is kind of our council. And then following the first round of zone council meetings, we had a zone council chair phone call. The conversations were focused on the status of the gauge, overview of the February and March lobster board meetings, and then we tried to update some of the information that was available to share with the fishermen. So we reviewed preliminary effort and landings data through 2024. Next slide, please. So what have we heard? And I would just characterize this as it's a mixed bag, but we have definitely heard that things are changing within the main portion of the Gulf of Maine. We had reports of more egg-bearing lobsters offshore. higher numbers of small sublegal egg-bearing lobsters, a general report that there seems to be fewer lobsters in inshore waters, and especially in southern Maine, a couple different discussions around the prevalence of predators. Again, it's been 10 years since I've been in a lobster conversation, and it sounds like 10 years ago in some respects, in that we were on the way up at that time with lobsters, and so now we're on a decline. So in response to the resource, the fishery is changing as well. Reports of more consistent year-round effort. Some areas are putting more traps in the water later, and reporting that it's really hard to make money in the spring fishery with the Canadian fisheries that open up sequentially. We are seeing a bit of an aging of the fleet. Folks are aging out of the fishery. The fishery now has a very high overhead, especially for young fishermen, for entry. And there's a general feeling that some of the limit entry schemes are starting to result in kind of a missing year class of fishermen that's working its way through the system. Next slide, please. Continuing on, while there was agreement that things are changing, different options on whether that warrants concern or action was mixed. What we heard was, for those who did not express concern, there was a considerable mention of the uptick in surveys over the last couple of years, that they're seeing more short lobsters and egg-bearing lobsters in their traps, and generally that we seem to be entering into a cooler period within the Gulf of Maine, with water temperatures down in 2024. The decline in landings was attributed more to a decline in effort and not the resource. And I think I would characterize that the survey not picking up spatial temporal changes in the resources is more of a mismatch between where the majority of the fishery is occurring and where the surveys occur. Those who expressed concern about the resource, they did express concerns about the decline in landings, particularly in the bays. People talked about how they're fishing on the run and that they've seen a decline in the number of selects or lobsters more than a couple pounds in their catch, and that the data presented around inflation and about how their expenses and that side of the equation is becoming much more problematic. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we've heard specifically on the gauge, some zones are still opposed. I think there would not have been a consensus in any of the zones for moving forward with a gauge increase. Some zones did comment that if Canada had been on board, it would have been a much easier acceptance of a change. We had individuals commented that the gauge increase helped in the 1980s, and a larger conversation around the 32nd of an inch increase and spreading it over more years would have been more palatable. And then there was a bit of conversation around how some of these proactive measures in the addendum 27 were kind of a one-way ticket of measures to be taken. Other topics, if we needed to take action, do one that maximizes the economic value of the fishery. There was support in trying to really bolster the approach around V-notching. There was concern about the equity among lobster management areas and with Canada. And there was some conversation, if the focus is on spawning stock biomass, then maybe considering for female only management measures. I think we got one more, or is that it? What's next? Okay, so again, following the first round of council meetings, we're having another round within the next couple of weeks. So fill up the gas tank and on the road we go. So we're gonna have a science update with each council. And we're also going to try to respond to some of the data requests that we did get from the council during the council meetings. We're strongly consider, hopefully we'll have a survey out in the next few weeks. And this would be largely a repeat of a survey the department sent out in 2008. That time in 2008, it was around, it's what they called an effort survey at the time. I think we want to expand it to solicit conversation around the resource and the economics of the fishery. We're also considering trying to do a market analysis. We definitely heard kind of economic concerns around the gauge increase. So trying to look at what some of the, if there's any quantifiable impacts around the impacts of gauge increase. And we're also talking about convening the main portion of the LCMT. I believe that is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl, and welcome. Any questions for Carl about his presentation? David Borden, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Carl, welcome first. I'd just like to, I'm just curious, there are a lot of similarities. If the guy sitting next to me did a survey with his industry in Massachusetts, he probably would have gotten a lot of the same comments from his industry. There's a lot of concern about input costs and the ability of the industry to kind of stay up with input costs. That's one of the things that's driving a lot of people out of business, particularly input costs in the offshore fishery can be $15,000, $20,000 per trip before the boat leaves the dock. I mean, it's really kind of hard to imagine the cost. But my question is, did they get into ways to the substance of how to improve the economics of the fishery? Did they start discussing different strategies on how to do that? Thank you.
I wouldn't say that it was the focus of the meeting. I think at this point we were really focusing on the gauge increases, and so most of the reflections were reflecting directly around the gauge increase. Yes, there were some conversations around the economic fisheries, and I think the pattern that you described of just the cost to untie the lines in the morning was bore out with one of the analyses that was presented was comparing the total value of the fishery corrected for inflation. And so while I think the 2025 numbers were the third or fourth highest value, gross value to the fishery, but when corrected for inflation, it was like the 11th highest value to the fishery. And that point alone, comparing to, okay, back, when we had a comparable value of a fishery, what were the input costs at that time? And that definitely struck a considerable amount of conversation. But as far as things that were put on the table or, points of emphasis, we talked about close seasons, especially in the spring. There were some mention around traps, if that would be a way to, improve the economics. And I think, individuals are, every time they go, they're trying to, minimize the cost. So.
Dennis Abbott.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. And a question for Carl. You received a lot of comments and you'll be receiving a lot more comments. At some point, will you reach a point with the industry of what their preferences might be in some sort of order that they would like to go forward with? Obviously, gauge increase isn't palatable. Numbers of trap reductions. Where do these things stand? At some point, if the assessment leads us where we don't want to be, some decisions will have to be made, and we can't make any decisions in this climate without having buy-in from the industry. So I think it's imperative that the industry gives us some indication of where they would like us, or what they would like us to do. That makes sense?
Yeah, it does, Dennis. And I would say that, again, preliminary, first round of conversations, I don't think we're at the point that industry would put their, kind of timeline forward for that. And I would say that just reflecting on our first round of zone council meetings, each zone expressed an interest in meeting more frequently, getting to know the conversations more deeply, and participating in more meaningful ways than they have. And I would say that's an encouragement. And if we are in a period where we're waiting for the assessment this fall, seeing what the results are, then I think we're in a good position to kind of carry these on. The idea of sending out a survey to each license holder was to try to cast as wide as net as possible, so we are not in the position where a vocal portion of the fishery are feeling that they're not being heard by the department. So.
John Clark.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Carl. I pretty much had the same question as Dennis. Just curious, in adding on to that, what proportion of your fishermen expressed real concern that we need to do something immediately? Because you said a bunch seemed to think that everything was getting better out there.
Well, I mean, participation was mixed within the zone. Each zone member is an elected representative, so they are representing a portion of fishermen within their area. It seemed to very much depend on where fishermen's fishing experience was. If it was inshore within 3 miles, it was less favorable than if it was offshore. If it was in Western Maine, there was more sentiments of stability than in Eastern Maine, where there's been more sentiments of volatility. They were also the most volatile area on the way up as well. But we did have fishermen say that they are not concerned by the resource, and then we did have some people also comment that they were. And again, I think that kind of a survey that they can fill out on their kitchen table, with some of these questions, is really intent to try to get beyond kind of some of the theatrics of public, controversial public meetings. So.
Ray Kane.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome, Carl. Just a couple of questions. I thought I saw on one slide that some of your harvesters were amenable to a 1/32 increase every other year.
They were interested in spreading it out. I wouldn't say that there was any consensus or timeline that was offered up, but the idea being that a 32nd of an increase spread over multiple times would be less noticeable and less impactful than a straight 1/16 of an inch right off the bat.
Thank you. Follow up. So you talk about your inshore fishery and offshore fishery. Just for the sake of the commission, how many years has the offshore fishery actually occurred in the state of Maine?
So when I say offshore, it's outside of 3 miles.
Outside, it's not like 20 miles or 30 miles, it's anything beyond 3 miles.
Yeah, anything beyond 3 miles out to the border of Area 1 and Area 3. And there has been a progression further offshore over the last 15 years. But the offshore fleet is always, or the offshore fishery, and it's not Area 3 offshore fishery. These are still, by and large, day trips. The proportion of offshore landings has slowly been increasing over the last 15 years. So it's becoming a higher prevalence, and there's more of a shift to the focus further offshore.
And is that due to the lack of lobster inshore? Is that why the harvesters are moving their gear offshore?
I would say for some, yeah. We've also heard that some of the whale regulations that required trawling up scenarios, that changes some of the dynamics and of how people would move gear inshore and offshore at various times of the year. And so in some ways, the effort required to gear up to fish large trawls offshore kind of limited the ability to, or the convenience of coming back inshore to chase lobsters during the summer months.
And one more question. Years ago, GMRI in their amphitheater, this has to be 10 or 15 years ago, they were bringing in, or we were told when we went up to the amphitheater and they did a presentation on the Maine lobster industry, they were bringing students, young students throughout the school system. And this has to do with trap allocation. And according to the people at GMRI, which I respect, and I'm sure you do, most of your harvesters can make as much money with 600 traps as they can. Years ago, the harvester would fish his 800, then his wife would have a permit, and the harvester would fish his wife's permit. But GMRI proved financially, economically, that they can make as much money with 600 traps, keeping costs down, because I lobstered for years, and the bottom, what you're looking for is the bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
And we've heard from Dave Borden about what it costs a boat to go to Area 3. So I'm wondering if that thought has been run by the harvesters in Maine to reduce the number of traps. Thank you.
Certainly traps have been a lively debate over the years within Maine. I did some of the research that you were referring to that was on display at GMRI. That was some of the work that I did when I was the lobster biologist for the state of Maine. I think it really depends on what the objectives are, and if the objectives are more around economics, then that's a healthy debate. I think the technical committee has been pretty clear that if you're trying to achieve biological objectives, then the trap reductions have to be pretty significant in order to achieve. You may have economic gains, but to achieve biological improvements, that break of when you start to see that is a considerable drop in traps.
Thank you.
Dan, go ahead.
Carl, I'd like to welcome you to this table, and on behalf of Mass DMF, say that we really look forward to working with you and DMR. We've been tracking your career for almost 30 years, and you've done some outstanding work in Maine, and we really look forward to the collaboration that I'm sure we're going to have. Two questions come to mind. One of your bullets talked about decline in catch was a result of decline in effort. Will Maine be in a position to document if that was true or not? Because I know you've got 100% reporting now. Would you be able to turn the crank and detect if there was a decline in trap hauls?
Yes, that was some of the information that was presented. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but generally speaking, our numbers of trips have declined from, say, a peak around 250,000 back in the 2008, 2010 time period to under 200,000 this past year. We've lost roughly 500 to 1,000 licenses over that same period as well, a couple hundred in the last few years. And then we can track activity and trap hauls as well. So,
great, I look forward to that. And then my second question is, the last bullet says to convene the main portion of the LCMT. Would there be a follow-up bullet to then convene the LCMT for all of Area 1? Because what you've got on that board is kind of what I asked for, is like asking that Maine sort of kind of get its house in order in terms of maybe a consensus position. Right. But I hope then you'd invite, or then we could convene the other two states for a follow-up.
Well, as we understood, your position was we needed to, as you said, we need to get our house in order first. And so we would absolutely be amenable to convening New Hampshire and Massachusetts as well. It's the feeling was we needed to be able to have that opinion to bring to you. So as I understood it, it was considered to be premature to convene the LCMT right now, but happy to do it.
Thank you.
David, if you can keep it real brief, and then we'll continue on and give New Hampshire.
A very brief question for Carl follow. Do you anticipate concluding this by the time we get the benchmark stock assessment? Is that like a general good estimate of when you would conclude this?
Yeah, so we're again starting up another round of zone council meetings immediately following this board meeting. If we can get the survey out and back and analyzed, we would like to have that data to present to zone councils before the October meeting. So we're bringing an industry-based survey, 3 rounds of zone council meetings, and then receiving the assessment results at that time to be prepared for that. So.
Thank you, Carl, for the update. I'll present briefly on New Hampshire. We're not quite as extensive as Maine, so I do not have a presentation, just a few bullet points here, and I'll keep it very brief. We have been working with our local Commercial Fishermen's Association to find the best time to have some discussions. And this coming Wednesday evening, Joshua Carloni, who is our invertebrate, and he's the biologist who oversees all our invertebrate programs, will be having a discussion with our Commercial Fishermen's Association at their meeting. And so a few of the points that they will be discussing are setting a baseline understanding of the biology, why we manage Gulf of Maine, Georges Bank as a single stock, and what surveys we use and why. So trying to set kind of some baseline information to start really having some good discussions. How the surveys that are currently feeding into the assessment do and what the current trends are within the stock itself. Get feedback about what the harvesters are seeing themselves on the water, which is an important part. This is a discussion. This is not us talking at our local industry members. We're there intentionally to have a discussion. And then to discuss potential areas where more partnership can occur with industry to help better understand lobster. And that's been, like in the state of Maine, that has been a big call in New Hampshire as well. So having that discussion on, we have programs on lobster boats that have gone on for years, but how can we do a better job of partnering with industry in ways that will make the needle move as far as science is concerned. So that's where we are right now. And then they're very much looking forward to hearing the results of the stock assessment, but this will be kind of a springboard for us, and then we'll continue from there. And to the point over here about the LCMTs, with the ultimate goal of getting the whole LCMT Area 1 group together to have a nice discussion, including the Maine and Massachusetts members. That is all I have for New Hampshire. Are there any questions for me before we move on to the main event here? Anybody online? Yeah, go ahead, Jeff. Kaylin.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So I want to welcome Carl also. I've known Carl since he was a preteen, I think, and it's really wonderful to see
I had hair
here today. So, you're a good man for the job. I just wonder if the states have reached out to Canada. Is there any discussions about that? Because that is the sticky wicket. And as I've said before, I think the last time this happened, it was beneficial to the industry, but this is always going to kind of slow this process down if there's no ongoing discussions with the Canadians about trying to come up to the same gauge size. So I just wondered before we close this out, whether there are plans to do that. Thanks.
So I'll speak first and then I'll kick it over to Carl. I think we're ahead of that at the moment. We're trying to figure out with industry what industry has buy-in for as far as things that might move forward. And clearly the Canadian piece is a big part of that. But, at this point, I think that probably, and I'll let Carl speak, we're not attached to Canada. So I'm not going to let New Hampshire take the road on that one. But it is, currently our tasking is to really engage with industry, see what they're seeing, what are some measures they feel they could get behind, with the Canadian piece being a part of that. So go ahead, Carl, if you have anything to add to that.
Well, there was a Lobsterman's Town meeting that was held in, I think, Bar Harbor. I did not attend. Dan did. Dan's probably in a better position to represent that meeting than I am. But I do think that it is, Canada is bounded to the state of Maine. It is an issue. And we do have a shared water referred to as the gray area that US and Canadian fishermen, jointly share. And so it's one more piece of, or one more area that would have measures that would not be harmonious with each other. And they already are right now, whether it be biological measures or gear configuration measures that make it for a very difficult time. So there's an incentive to have the conversation with Canada. It's just, maybe Dan can speak to a little bit on what the best way to move that needle is.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. I think one of the really interesting outcomes from last June's meeting at was it Moncton or St. John, was a desire on the part of some of the Canadian fishermen to have conversations about it. And I think at the time, Commissioner Kelleher had kind of wanted to take you, Carl, on the road, or at least virtual meetings, and try to talk some of the LFA reps and to, kind of work from below. No, I know there was some interest. I can tell you that at the meeting that we held at Bar Harbor, some of the Canadian folks had come down, and this was right after the election, and things were a little bit more tense, be given with the potential for tariffs and the unknown state of affairs between the two nations. But they tell me at home I'm a pathological optimist. I do believe that it would be a great strategy to have conversations maybe between the states and some of the LFAs, even if it's informal, to see if we can get those folks to consider it, because what we saw is that the trends in catch were very, very similar to the US side of the Gulf of Maine and Area 1, with declining CPUE and so there was some legitimate interest and maybe among some to proceed maybe together. And I think we should try to do that, to be honest. And you'd be great in that role, given your science background and your understanding of Maine DMR's fishery independent work.
Really quickly, Carl, and then we'll move on.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And I would just say that, the conversations with Canadians would really speak to the equity issue around management measures. And that was, at least in the eastern portion of the state, that rang true for all those areas. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, in the interest of time, we are going to move on to our next agenda item, which is to consider Addendum 32 on repealing gauge and vent size changes of Addendum 27 for final approval. I move to Caitlin Starks for a presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So in my presentation today, I'm going to go over the draft Addendum 32 document that went out for public comment, and I'll cover the timeline for the addendum, the objective, the background and statement of the problem, and then I'll go over the proposed management options included in the document. And following that, I'll review the public comments we received and the board action for consideration today. Draft Addendum 32 was initiated in February of 2025, and then in March 2025, as noted earlier, the board approved the addendum for public comment. So the comment period was from late March through April 25th. And during that period, we had one virtual public hearing. And then our last thing on here is that the board will be considering the addendum for final approval today. So in February, the board made this motion to initiate draft Addendum 32, and this really just gets to the objective of the addendum, which is to repeal the gauge and vent size measures of Addendum 27. And I think most of the board is fairly familiar at this point, but the history on draft Addendum 32 relates back to the approval of Addendum 27 in May 2023 to increase the protection of the Gulf of Maine spawning stock. Addendum 27 responded to low levels of settlement and declining recruitment in the Gulf of Maine from about 2012 forward. And it took a proactive approach that established a trigger mechanism based on recruitment abundance indices. The trigger, when reached, would initiate a series of gauge and vent size changes for LCMA 1, 3, and Outer Cape Cod. And a trigger index was developed using 3 recruitment abundance indices from the Gulf of Maine. And Addendum 27 said that if the trigger index declined by 35% from the reference period, which was 2016 through 2018's average value of the index, then the measures would be automatically implemented. And then in October 2023, when we added in the 2022 index data, the trigger index had declined by 39%, and that triggered the implementation of the series of management measures. And so the original Addendum 27 implementation date for the first of the measures, which was the increase to the LCMA 1 minimum gauge size, was June 1st, 2024. And then in October 2023, the board delayed implementation of those measures, all of those measures in Addendum 27 to January 1st, 2025. And then via Addendum 31, the board postponed implementation of the Outer Cape gauge size and V-notch definition, as well as the LCMA 1 gauge and vent sizes an additional 6 months to July 1st, 2025. And those changes were to provide the industry and gauge makers more time to prepare for those changes and coordinate with Canada on the management and trade issues. But in the meantime, the lobster industry in the Gulf of Maine did continue to express concerns about potential economic impacts of Addendum 27 and uncertainty about impacts on trade with Canada. And in February, the board agreed that consideration of alternative measures was warranted to address these concerns, and the Gulf of Maine states also committed to working with their lobster industries to identify alternative conservation strategies. So that brings us to the proposed management options in draft Addendum 32, and there are only 2 options. Option A is status quo, and option B is to repeal the Addendum 27 gauge and vent size changes. Sorry, my computer's doing weird things. So I'll go over option A first. The current implementation schedule for all of the Addendum 27 measures would be maintained. And this table shows when each of those changes is set to be implemented under Addendum 27. The changes are shown in bold text. So the first is the LCMA 1 minimum size increase to 3 5/16 of an inch, which is set to occur July 1st, 2025. Also on July 1st of this year, the maximum gauge size change for all permit holders in Outer Cape Cod would become 6 3/4 inches, and the V-notch possession definition for all permit holders would be 1/8 of an inch with or without sedal hairs. The second change is that on July 1st, 2027, the LCMA 1 minimum size increase would occur again, and then the LCMA 1 vent size change would occur on July 1st, 2028. And then lastly, on July 1st, 2029, the maximum gauge size decrease for Outer Cape Cod and LMA 3 would be implemented. And then under option B, all changes to the gauge and escape vent sizes established by Addendum 27 would be repealed. This includes the maximum gauge change for Outer Cape Cod on July 1st under section 3.1 of Addendum 27, and all of the minimum and maximum gauge size and vent size changes triggered under section 3.2. Option B, however, would not affect the measures of Addendum 27 pertaining to the V-notch possession definition in Outer Cape Cod, nor the issuance of trap tags. So therefore, under option B, that V-notch definition change would still take place on July 1st, 2025, and the trap tag rules are already effective as of January 1st of this year. So now I'll just go over the public comment. As I mentioned, there was one public hearing that we had via webinar on April 10th. There were 82 people from the public in attendance, and 35 people made comments during the hearing. And for written comments, the deadline was April 25th at 11:59 p.m. and we received 155 total written comments, including 5 letters from organizations. And sorry, this is not updated, but it's okay. We had 5 letters from organizations and more individuals, which is updated in the next table. So this is the breakdown of support, excellent, for the comments. There's no total here because some of the individuals who made public hearing comments also submitted written comments, but you can see that the large majority of comments supported option B to repeal the gauge and vent size measures. And from the few comments that supported option A to maintain the addendum 27 measures, the rationales given were that as a public resource, lobster management should use the science we have, and that those who ignore it are protecting their self-interest. And another comment stating that the harvesters will not go out of business with the gauge increase because after 1 year, the lobster catch weight will be even higher. Within the comments supporting option B, there were several common themes. One overarching theme was that the gauge and vent size measures are not necessary. Reasons that commenters cited for this were that Maine already has strict conservation measures with the lower maximum size and V-notch requirements. A number of comments suggested that the fishermen in the Gulf of Maine are seeing an increase in the number of shorts or juvenile lobsters, not a decline. Several comments noted that the predation of those juvenile lobsters is the driver of declines in the lobster population rather than the fishery. And some others said that fishing effort is also declining, hence the decrease in landings, either because of aging out of the fleet or choosing not to fish due to high costs of fuel and equipment. There was also a group of comments that focused on the data used in addendum 27, and these comments generally said the measures are not needed because the data showing those declines in recruitment are either wrong or there weren't enough years of data. And many also said we should wait until after the 2025 benchmark assessment to consider any actions. And then another major theme across the comments was that the gauge increases would cause significant economic harm, including to harvesters, processors, dealers, the rest of the supply chain, as well as the local Maine communities that rely heavily on the lobster industry. Some mentioned that increasing the LMA1 minimum size while Canada's minimum size is maintained would put the US industry at a severe disadvantage and give Canada more control of the chick market and would also stifle conservation benefits if Canada still has a lower minimum size. Several comments mentioned that they're unsure the measures will be effective and offered alternatives like zero tolerance for V-notching in all management areas, protecting large lobster versus small, and trap limit reductions. And then there were also many comments saying that the industry was not given a sufficient opportunity to engage in developing the measures for addendum 27, and that the process should have included the LCMTs. In addition to the comments that were directly related to addendum 32, there were 10 comments addressing the addendum 27 measures for Outer Cape Cod specifically. These comments expressed opposition to implementation of any of the gauge, vent, or V-notch measures for the Outer Cape Cod area from addendum 27. Several Outer Cape fishermen expressed frustration because they're the only area that will be implementing addendum 27 measures if this is approved, referring to the V-notch definition. Despite having the smallest fleet and the least landings contributed in the Gulf of Maine. They also commented that Outer Cape Cod already has more strict measures than the other areas, that including the larger minimum gauge size, shorter seasons due to closures for whales, and lower trap limits. And for those reasons, the comments on this topic expressed that implementing the measures for Outer Cape Cod is discriminatory and will not have a real conservation benefit. And then there were a few other comments unrelated to the addendum. These were that the board should look at the impacts of other ocean uses on the lobster fishery and the ecosystem, and that fishermen spend their lives on the water and therefore they are the experts about what is going on with the lobster resource and the fishery, and also noting that it is in the harvester's best interest to maintain a sustainable population and their input on management measures should be considered and valued. And to wrap up, the board actions for consideration today are to select a management option from draft addendum 32 and approve final addendum 32. I can take any questions.
Are there any questions for Caitlin? Okay, seeing no questions for Caitlin, I think we have a motion to dispense with from our last meeting. So we're going to bring that up. Okay, so we have a motion from our last meeting that's been brought back. Been told to read this into the record. Okay, so bear with me here. It's a bit of a long one. So main motion was move to add, let me get rid of this thing blocking my screen. Move to add an item to option B in the addendum that says that Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts will provide for the board by the winter 2026 meeting consensus positions to be the basis of future addendum actions affecting the biological productivity of the Gulf of Maine lobster fishery. Motion was made by Mr. Hasberg, seconded by Mr. Kalin. That was postponed. And then there was a motion to substitute, move to substitute with move to add an item to option B in the draft addendum that says that Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts will provide for the board by the winter 2026 meeting state consensus positions. Motion made by Mr. Borden and seconded by Mr. Abbott. As noted earlier, these would be a change to the addendum, and if we moved forward, we would have to go out to public comment. Am I correct in that? Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, for that. Tony covered most of it, but she's working on something else, so I'll jump in. Yeah, you know, if my recollection of this conversation at the March meeting was that some of the board members were interested in putting a very detailed timeline on the two states, New Hampshire and Massachusetts, as they work with their industry to bring things back to the board. If this were to go out to, or if the board incorporated this notion and we went back at the public hearings, this would not allow the approval of this addendum until after the July 1st implementation date of the gauge size changes and vent changes. So that potentially can create a problem that should be considered. I think it's worth noting also that this board and the policy board asked the ASMFC to send a letter off to both states, and we've done that. And in that letter, it requests an update from both of those states at each quarterly meeting. So the states have been asked to provide quarterly updates on their progress, similar to what we got earlier in this meeting. So some of the intent of this motion, I think, has already been accomplished through that letter that we've asked those states to provide some updates. So the board obviously can take this wherever they want, but if it is if the board does want to incorporate this into the addendum, it would change the approval date until August, which would be after our meeting in August, which would create potential conflicts with that July 1 date.
Thanks, Bob. So I'll go to the board. Go ahead, David Borden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Two points. One, I think it's kind of a moot point. The addendum's already gone out to public hearing. And I can't see any advantage of slowing that down or repeating that process at this point. So as far as that part of it, I think we don't need a date or a deadline. In terms of having a deadline, I still think it's important for this board. I'd also point out that the letter already went to the states. So if we were going to have a deadline, the date should have been in that letter. But now I think we find ourselves in the situation where you've got an addendum benchmark that's going to come up here. We'll get the results of that. And in coordination with that benchmark, I think we're going to need to revise the lobster regulations in a number of areas, including some of the Mid-Atlantic areas, potentially, since some of those boats fish up in the Gulf of Maine. So I think this all ought to be folded into that timeline. So I'm not in favor of the motion and the substitute motion at this point, but I think that the board should basically establish its own deadline for the states to meet with their LCMTs at some point and bring back recommendations, and that would be after the benchmark would be my recommendation.
Dennis Abbott.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Being the seconder of the substitute motion, at the time we made the motion, I think we were looking, to ensure that some action was going to be taken. And I think that the conversation with Carl in the past few minutes has allayed some of our concerns and laid out a path ahead. So procedurally, I'm not sure whether we need to vote these motions down, call for a vote, and request everyone vote against the motions as they are on the board.
Okay, I think anybody else have a comment to make before we call a vote on the motions? Okay, seeing some head shakes, we're going to go ahead and deal with the substitute motion first. Okay, and let's try this. Is there, I guess it doesn't really. Okay. Is there any objection? Oh, Mike Luisi, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a point of order. Are we allowed to, is it easier just to table this and have it go away and start over rather than voting against something that, and trying to get everybody on the same page? I'd be happy to make a motion to table if you think that process is easier.
Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, I think procedurally to clearly spell out where the board is, it might be better to vote on both of these. And procedurally, again, the chair may be able to say, is there anyone in favor of this motion? If there are no hands that go up, it fails. And you can do that maybe twice and move quickly, but that's up to the board. We'll see how that goes. I don't want to overpromise anything.
Okay, seeing no other hands, I'm going to take Bob's suggestion. Is there anyone in favor of the substitute motion? Seeing no hands, motion fails, and we move on to the main motion. Is there anyone in favor of the main motion? Are there any abstentions? Seeing no one in favor of the main motion, the motion fails unanimously. Thank you all for your process on that. David Borden, go ahead.
I totally approve of that outcome, but I think that gets back to the point that Dennis made, that a lot of us that supported this, and I'm not re-arguing the case, a lot of us that supported this wanted to have some deadline so it wouldn't be open-ended. In other words, if we're going to revise, take actions on the benchmark stock assessment, we don't know what the results of that are at this point, and but we will shortly. And so states and different LCMTs should start meeting and talking about revisions to the lobster regulations if they needed, and prioritize those so that they're in a position on a timely basis to give us their recommendations. So don't wait, basically. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Okay, I think what we'll do at this time is I'd be willing to entertain a motion to kick off the discussion. So I believe we have a motion. Oh, Caitlin's going to jump in briefly.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to briefly correct the record on the number of comments. It is accurately reflected in the memo that's in the materials, but the real numbers of comments were 157 individuals and 5 letters.
Thanks, Caitlin. Okay, at this time, is there anyone that would like to bring forth a motion to start our discussion? Carl Wilson, go ahead. Give us a second to get it up.
Okay, well, see how this stuff works. Move to adopt option B. Option B, repeal addendum 27, gauge and vent size measures, and approve addendum 32 effective June 30th, 2025.
Dennis Abbott, is that a second?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm happy to second Mr. Wilson's motion.
I don't know that we need any rationale, but if anybody would like to follow up, we've had a lot of discussion about this topic. You are welcome to, as the maker of the motion. We'll follow.
I think I've talked enough.
Dennis, anything else you'd like to contribute? Okay. All right, is there any discussion from the board on this motion? Okay. Does anybody need any time to caucus before I call the vote?
Excuse me, I've had my hand up.
Oh, apologies for that, Emerson. I don't have the electronic hands. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm not really much in favor of option B. Not so much in terms of trying to respond to the industry concerns in Maine and New Hampshire. I'm supportive of that. But I think what we're doing here, and I said this at the previous meeting, we're setting up what might be a bad precedent. We're reacting to this. We're repealing the addendum 28 gauge and vent size measures based on pushback from the governors of Maine and New Hampshire, who said they will not implement those measures in their state. So now the effectiveness of this board and this commission is being directed by governors in a political process. And I'm very uncomfortable with that, because where does this lead in the future? And I don't mean lobsters, I mean, pick any other controversial species. Striped bass, summer flounder, menhaden, what's going to be next? So I'm really concerned about doing this. Thank you.
Thank you, Emerson. Dennis Abbott, go ahead.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. And to address the things that Emerson just spoke about, I stated basically the same things of the implications of political forces above our head entering into our decision-making process. But I do think that we have to be realistic here. This is where we are. And so a lot of times doing this is like making sausage. You know, you don't know what's going into it, but you hope something good comes out of it. And I think the bottom line is today we're doing the right thing, but in the future we have to be very cautious as we manage species. And it's only going to get more difficult as time goes on, regardless.
Roy Miller, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I certainly understand what Emerson is saying. And I do share those concerns that he expressed. However, the other side of the coin is that it lets the public know that we do in fact listen to them, and we do give them opportunity to comment, and we do take their lifelong observations seriously and act upon it when we feel it's in everyone's best interest. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments before we call the vote? Okay, seeing none, this is final action, so we are going to take a roll call vote. Okay. Anyone in favor of the motion? Yes. Yeah, we'll give 1 minute to caucus. Okay, does anyone need any additional time? All right, I'm going to go ahead and call the vote. Please raise your hand if you are in favor of the motion on the board.
Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, Maine, New Hampshire.
Anyone opposed? Any null votes? And any abstentions?
John, are you abstaining or null voting?
We're abstaining from the vote.
Thank you. New York abstains. And NOAA Fisheries, sorry.
Okay, the motion carries. 9 in support, no abstention, 2 abstentions, and 0 in opposition. That concludes that agenda item. So we are going to call on Hank Sewell, who's going to give a report from the Lobster Conservation. Good? Okay. Yep, 9 in favor. From the Lobster Conservation Management Team for Area 3.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Hank Soul. I'm the chairman of the Area 3 Lobster Conservation Management Team. We are a 10-member advisory body, industry advisory body under the oversight of Chairman McKiernan of Massachusetts. Just as a brief background, back in 2009, a stock assessment was issued that indicated that the Southern New England lobster resource was depleted. And in response to that, in 2013, this body approved 2 addenda 21 and 22, that primarily was trying to accomplish 2 things: to try to reduce effort on the Southern New England stock, to sort of scale the effort invested in the fishery to the depleted size of the resource, and also to address some consolidation concerns. This body passed those motions, and it went to the National Marine Fisheries Service, and for whatever reason, it sort of lied fallow there for about 10 years until it finally came back in the last year or so. And in the intervening decade, the industry and apparently this body alike felt that there have been a lot of changes in the fishery that really no longer warranted some of the conservation suggestions that were contained, and consolidation questions that were contained in those 2 addenda. And so the commission sort of went back out to the industry for some feedback on what alternative measures, if any, should be implemented, and also was trying to get a sense from the industry if it felt that some of the changes that had occurred in the industry had sort of addressed some of the concerns contained in those addenda. So we met on April 2nd, 2025 to discuss all this. In the intervening time, a report was produced, which you all received from the Lobster PDT, that talked about various metrics of effort that had changed in the Southern New England area over the course of time. And you'll see that contained in the memo, sort of in the middle paragraph. Several different percentage reductions in traps and effort and that sort of thing are described there. So our discussion at the meeting really was very narrowly focused on the 2 primary goals of the addenda. One was to reduce effort via trap allocation in the Southern New England fishery exclusively by 25%. And then secondly, to limit permit consolidation within Area 3 by establishing ownership caps. And we had actually met back in June of 2024 to broach this topic. At that time, the industry attending that meeting felt that it was likely that the conservation objectives had largely been achieved, and the PDT's data seemed to buttress that impression to some extent. So for instance, if you look at that report on page 4, there's table 2, which talks about the number of Area 3 permits that have been issued to vessels over the course of a decade from 2014 to 2023. And as the meeting summary report indicates, we've seen a 28 reduction overall in those permits that were issued to boats. But if you actually do a little bit of math on that table, if you take a look at the permits from Rhode Island South, which it seems likely are ones that are more focused on Southern New England stock area than others might be, you see that actually the number of permits issued to vessels had dropped by about 50%. Further down in the PDT report on page 11, there were a couple of graphs there that talk about trip counts and landings by area. And at this point, we don't have a nice table to work with, so you got to pull out a microscope to sort of look at these numbers. But you see the trip count for federal Area 3 vessels from 2014 to 23 dropped from about 700 to about 350. So a roughly 50% decline there. And similarly, the landings by area for the Area 3 vessels for the Southern New England area have dropped from just, looks like over 1 million pounds to just under 500,000 pounds in that same 10-year period of 2014 to 2023. The PDT report back on page 9 also cites a 4.3% reduction in the maximum allocated traps that might have been fished in Area 3. It doesn't break it out by specific region like Southern New England, but if you actually go back to the 2020 stock assessment report, Table 19 on page 187 does contain that data, not for Area 3, but the entire southern New England region. And what you see there is that for the most recent 10-year period, which goes from 2019 to 2018, 2009 to 2018, that's the terminal year in the stock assessment report. You see that the total number of traps fished in southern New England falls from about 265,000 down to about 148,000, which is a drop of about 44%. So when we talked about all these data, we chewed it over during the course of this meeting for, I would say, at least an hour and a half. For these reasons, the Area 3 Lobster Conservation Management Team felt that the effort reduction objectives of those addenda that were passed back in 2013 had likely been accomplished. On the topic of consolidation, we started to dip our toes into that one, but frankly didn't have the time to really delve into it the way that we had delved into the effort reduction measures. So we're going to address that a little bit further as I talk here about the next steps for the Area 3 Conservation Management Team. We are going to allow for appointment of team alternates. As I said earlier, there are 10 slots there. We only had 5 industry members attending. There was some concern expressed about that. And we think that one way to increase attendance is to allow for the appointment of alternates to the primary members who are appointed. We need to increase the number of industry participants in these meetings. We're going to do a much deeper dive into the consolidation objectives and metrics, both past and present, that are occurring in the Area 3 fishery. And then thinking a little bit beyond that, of course, we have the fall stock assessment review that's coming up. I think that that'll generate some discussion after the meeting. And just in general, the conservation team for Area 3 hadn't met for a few years. We don't think that's the greatest idea. I think the plan moving forward is to meet at least once a year, if nothing else, and just touch base on what the most recent turn of the crank assessment information is, trends that we're seeing in the fishery, and any other items of interest. Madam Chair, that concludes my report. Happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you for the report. Are there any questions for Hank? Seeing no questions, thank you, Hank.
Thank you, everybody.
Next on our agenda, we have an update on the Joint New England and Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council Alternative Gear Marking Amendment. So Allie Murphy, take it away.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Want to first acknowledge my counterpart at Garfo, Caroline Potter, who's done the lion's share of the work on this action and who co-presented this action to both councils. I'm gonna, just because I'm here, I'm going to be presenting an update to you all today. Next slide, please. So prior to 2021, the Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Plan regulations included fishery closures called restricted areas for the Northeast lobster and Jonah crab fishery, intended to protect seasonal aggregations of right whales. In 2021, those areas were transitioned to, they were both expanded and transitioned to closures to persistent buoy lines. Now, because the federal lobster regulations require surface markers, these areas still function as closures for the lobster and Jonah crab fishery. We anticipate that the take reduction team will convene in the near future to consider additional measures to reduce risk from all fisheries. They couldn't consider additional closures for restricted areas for the lobster industry, for other fisheries, or they could consider something like one-end ropeless for use broadly, seasonally, or even dynamically. Given the current and potential future regulations, this action is intended to provide additional fishing opportunities to the fishing industry by increasing or maintaining access to areas where persistent buoy lines are or could be restricted. And this would remove the present need for exempted fishing permits for industry to trial on-demand gear presently. Next slide, please. So on the council side, there are several fishery management plans and fishery regulations that require surface markings for fixed gear fisheries. I've got them listed here, and if you all are interested in reading the regulations, those are included in the decision document that were posted with meeting materials. But I'll note that the combination of the prohibition and the groundfish regulations require anyone fishing with bottom tending fixed gear to mark their gear with surface markers, and that's a radar, reflector, and pennants. Next slide, please. Notable to you all, I have included here the lobster surface marking, gear marking regulations. I'm not going to read this all to you because it's quite lengthy. But they also require lobster permit holders to mark their gear, and those requirements vary depending on how many traps are being fished. Next slide, please. So what's happened to date at the respective Mid-Atlantic and New England April Council meetings? The councils met. They initiated a framework that considers options for allowing alternative marking provisions in their fixed gear fisheries. This action could allow fixed gear vessels the flexibility to use alternative gear marking, but by no means requires alternatively marked gear to be used. Going forward, our hope is that with a resulting rulemaking for both efficiency and consistency, to use that one rulemaking to modify both our council regs and our lobster regs. So I am here today to engage with you as the commission and the states on the lobster side of this action. Next slide, please. Just a quick timeline here. We intend to reconvene with the councils and provide an update in June, and then hope that the action is ready for the councils to take final action come the fall. And we also intend to provide the commission updates at their similarly scheduled meetings. Our hope is that this action will be complete before the next round of take reduction team meetings, potentially this fall, so that whatever changes we make to the fishery management plans can be considered for the take reduction team as they consider developing additional risk reduction measures. Next slide, please. So just before getting into the details of what's in this document, I just quickly wanted to mention what this action would and wouldn't do. It would consider some fairly targeted regulatory modifications that would consider the use of alternative gear marking. This action is not envisioned to get into the details on technical specifications or data governance or management or enforcement. These topics are critically important to the success of any future program, but they aren't things that we expect to put into regulation. So I've kind of binned those as outside the scope of this action. Next slide, please. So before the council's initiated action, the PDT FMAT met twice and has developed some alternatives. This first group of alternatives considers options for when and where alternative gear marking could be considered for use. And that's from nowhere, the no action alternative, to everywhere, that's the middle alternative. And then the bottom one limits would limit use to only in the times and areas of the take reduction plan restricted areas. Next slide, please. The second group of alternatives considers whether training or some demonstration of knowledge should be included. And the PDT FMAT has discussed a range of examples from other federal fisheries, including something as simple as watching a training video to an in-person training, or something as complicated as taking test trips to demonstrate knowledge and competency with gear or with gear requirements. Next slide, please. Since the councils met, there has been one additional PDT FMAT meeting. At that meeting, the group added a spatial alternative to that first set of alternatives to consider allowing alternatively marked gear year-round in the take reduction plan restricted areas, not just seasonally. So that contrasts with the alternative on the previous slide. The group also revised the need statement for the educational alternatives and began brainstorming gear marking attributes to inform functional equivalence. And some of the topics discussed were retrievability, set direction, timing, and viewing distance. This was really just an initial discussion, and the PDT FMAT is already polling for dates for a next meeting to continue this discussion. Next slide, please. And I think that's all I have. I'm happy to take questions and certainly open to and welcome input on this action thus far. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Allie. Are there any questions for Allie? John Clark, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the presentation, Allie. Just curious if the interest in the alternative gears has been increasing. It sounded, I just was wondering how much the technology has improved. It sounded like there wasn't a lot of interest in it because of the cost in previous years.
I don't have the numbers offhand. I think I can speak to our participation in the exempted fishing permit that the NOAA Northeast Fisheries Science Center has. Generally, I'd say the number of participants has increased since the EFP started 3 to 4 years ago. So, you know, certainly the gear being tested right now is more expensive than current surface marking. But I think some folks see this as, you know, as the flexibility that it's intended to provide, that it may provide access to areas and seasons where gear marked with surface markers are closed, and that may be of interest to some.
Yeah, go ahead, Carl.
Just have a question of, I mean, we've heard today that there's an incredible diversity within this fleet, whether it be the Outer Cape Cod, relatively, you know, near shore fishery, or a shared fishery on the Canadian-US border, or changes in the main fishery. And I'm just wondering if the process that you have identified here has a way to more formally engage kind of the lobster fishery through ASMFC, for instance, the LCMTs, for instance. If that's an appropriate question, I guess, is how can this group be more participatory in those deliberations?
Thanks. I think we're lucky to have Caitlin serve on the plan development team, fishery management action team. So, you know, thanks to her and her efforts on that. I think, you know, I certainly don't want to dictate to this board how you all might want to get the input from the industry that that you all work with. So I think getting industry input into this process is certainly an important piece.
Just a quick follow-up. So would there be a process that you'd be coming back to this board that then could be brought, we could disseminate out to the LCMTs and then return input?
I mean, I'm certainly intending, as long as the schedule allows, to revisit and provide updates to this board in August and in October. And so if the board wishes to, you know, in conjunction with those meetings, provide an opportunity for updates to the LCMTs or AP, I think, you know, that could be the will of the board here.
Can I go to Tony for some clarification?
So I'm gonna be more direct than Carl, I think. Allie, you've heard me have concerns that the Lobster Board or the commission does not have a vote on the Mid-Atlantic Council, nor does it have a vote on the New England Council. And if those two bodies make decisions that are not something that the commission wants to move forward with, they will have given you a document that we have no say on as a board or the commission. If our industry has input they want to provide, they're not going to be able to do that through that council process because there's not public hearings through, I think it's a framework that this is working through. So public comment is a little bit more challenging, I'll say, in the framework because I don't think it's as transparent of how to do that. Or at least from speaking with folks, especially the lobster board or lobster fishermen who are very unfamiliar with the council process. One of the things that we brought up as a concern is that if we provide you comments as a lobster board, how does that input impact the council's decisions? NOAA has made decisions that are not recommendations of the commission prior to, and so that is a possibility, at least on the table to me, as you guys could move forward with something that the lobster fishery does not want. I recognize that we do not have gear marking regulations on the books for the commission, but the states do individually have gear marking books or on the books. And sometimes the states sit at the table for the councils representing a different set of fishermen. And so it's difficult to try to balance that input when they're thinking about the groundfish fishery versus the lobster fishery. So it can be difficult for them to provide that vote. And so there's that concern. And then we also have a concern about sort of this unknown factor of the standards that will go into the proposed rule. And so I'm hoping that we can have better clarity on how the commission's recommendations are influencing the decision that goes forward with NOAA on this framework. And then even more importantly to me, because I think it will impact the lobster fleet more significantly, is those standards. And how do we get to have a say in those standards when we don't know what the standards will be until the proposed rule comes out? And that's a quick turnaround. And I don't know how we get comment from our industry in that short of amount of time.
A lot to unpack there, Tony. Let's see where to start. I guess I would say, you know, I don't want to dictate to, you know, I don't feel like it would be appropriate for me to dictate to this board how to get input from the industry that this board serves. So if you all feel like getting input from your AP or LCMTs would inform the input that you would provide to me either here or through the council process, I think that's certainly your prerogative. I certainly, to your point about input into the process, you know, I certainly intend to take input that this lobster board gives me today to the next PDT meeting, much like we had taken input that the New England Council gave us
to the last PDT meeting. So, you know, I guess I can't really say what the councils will do, you know, as they work through their formal process. But, you know, I think you are also a management partner here and have valuable input into the process as the action develops.
I guess I'll say sort of we definitely appreciate you letting us bring some states into the PDT, and that was really helpful, and thank you. I think it's difficult for this board, I think, and for the commission to try to seek input on a document that is not ours, but we know it is going to impact fishermen that we represent. And so it's disappointing that NOAA has not figured out a way to reach out to the lobster industry specifically on a document that is going through the council process that is going to significantly impact the lobster fishery. And it's not our document.
Ray Kane.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ally, for the presentation. I'm going to piggyback off of what Carl and Tony Kearns both had spoken about. We, as a commission and a board, manage lobster. And I find it contrary that NOAA goes to the New England Council and the Mid-Atlantic Council, and like we're the puppy, you know, trying to get up the ladder. I should think you could go back to your bosses and tell them that, you know, in all honesty, the commission manages lobster, as you've heard from this entire conversation all afternoon, as opposed to going to the New England Council and the Mid and then coming back to us. As Tony has said, we are the ones managing our harvesters. So I would appreciate you going back to NOAA and giving them my sentiments. Thank you.
David Borden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ally, thanks for the presentation. I'm just curious, taking this a step further, what's the process now being envisioned to get monitoring units on the mobile gear fleet? Because this is just what's been discussed as only one component of how you would mark. And I served on the TRT for a number of years. And there's a lot of discussion about getting mobile gear boats to have monitoring units so they can detect ropeless gear in these closed areas in advance. So those two federal processes, it seems to me, have to come together. So what is the timeline on that second facet of this issue?
One thing, David, when you say monitoring systems, I think you're talking about the ability for them to see the gear on the bottom. Is that correct? We think in this world, we're thinking monitoring as in kind of VMS style systems. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear for everyone. Okay, Ally, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Great question. And I think, you know, David, you raise a good point that there's been a lot of work done to date. There is still a lot of work to do in all aspects of this, of alternative surface markers being used before this gear is ready to be operationalized. Specifically to your point, there's, I think our Fisheries Science Center folks, and I believe Maine DMR has also been working on gear visualization. There are a couple of different ways that gear could be visualized, either directly through a transducer or through internet service on vessels. So, you know, I don't think we're down a specific path yet, and there's more work to be done, but that research is ongoing.
Dan McKiernan. Oh, David, did you have a follow-up?
Thank you very much for the response. As I understand it, there isn't a deadline on the second part yet, but there will be at some point. That'll come forward, which, going back to the point that Tony made, I think Tony was being very polite about the potential for a disconnect here. Somehow we have to get the lobster industry to meet, representatives of the lobster industry to meet with NOAA to talk about the whole gear marking setup. And I just give this to everyone as an example. Between Long Island and Martha's Vineyard, if you go out 30 miles, I bet there are 6 different marking systems in place, all from different states and jurisdictions. It's a hodgepodge of marking systems. Some fishermen set north and south, northeast, southwest, easterly in certain areas. Somehow the industry has to have input into the development of these regs. Otherwise, we're going to end up with a bit of a train wreck at the end of this process. Thank you.
Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, I do agree with all the previous speakers about the challenges, but I just do want to remind the board that I think what NOAA is trying to do here is create a little less red tape in terms of being able to conduct, some on-demand fishing. Because as of this moment, anyone who wants to do that, and it's typically being done in a closed area, has to apply for an experimental fishing permit, and I think it's overly burdensome. It requires the Science Center folks to be sort of controlling the number of participants. There is a fair amount of grant money that's out there that I think that this process would be accelerated if this process was allowed to move forward faster. And I think that's what the intent of this is. I do take to heart Tony's comments and David's comments, especially about the need when we start to do this in a more, large scale basis with competing users and different gear types on top of one another. We have to get more involved. But for now, this isn't a fix that no one needs, so that if somebody wants to cut one inline off, they don't have to get an experimental fishing permit from the Science Center in Garfo. So this is there's an element of this that's really simple.
Any other questions for Allie? Okay. Seeing no other questions, we'll move to our next agenda item, which is an update on the American Lobster benchmark stock assessment. And Tracy Pugh, I believe, is leading this. So Tracy, go ahead.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
All right, great. So this is going to be pretty brief. We can go to the next slide, please. So essentially, we are on track. So our survey data and landings data have all been finalized. We have completed some base model runs, some sensitivities, and even gotten through some preliminary projections. So those have been completed and reviewed. Most of the analytical stuff that we are still working on is in this in progress section here. So that includes the model-free indicators, some summarization and examination of commercial sea sampling data, an update and review of a few environmental data time series, and then we are still anticipating the final analyses from the UMaine group, who's been working with some socioeconomic indicators for us. Next slide, please. So the items in gray here are what we've done recently. So we had a second assessment workshop in February of this year. Since then, so from the rest of February and most of March, we were meeting pretty much weekly on phone calls on Friday mornings to just get updates and check in on progress and see how things are going. We've had a couple of webinars since early March, and our next webinar is scheduled for May 15th. On that one, we're going to look at a couple of those pending items from the previous slides. So we'll do our final look and review at a couple of those analytics. we are anticipating a webinar where the technical committee is going to essentially receive and review and hopefully approve the assessment. And after that, it goes out to the peer review. So right now, we are thinking that the peer review is going to take place either late in August or early in September. My understanding is the commission is in the process of finalizing our reviewers and that schedule. And if that all goes to plan, which it should, we will then be presenting the assessment and the peer review report to the board at your October meeting. And that's pretty much what I have. So I can take any questions that anyone has.
Questions for Tracy? Seeing no questions, thank you for your presentation, Tracy.
Yep, thanks.
That brings us to the end here. Is there any other business to come before the board? Dennis?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I note since the ascension of you to being the chair that we are now lacking a vice chair. Do you have plans to find a vice chair?
I've been told that will happen in the next meeting. Anything else to come before the board? Okay, with that, we are adjourned. Thank you for your time, and I'll kick it over to Bob.